in this lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about creating geometry in ZBrush. So I just want to reinforce the things that we talked about as far as creating geometry and being able to edit those, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about primitives and how we can start to manipulate those. So to initially draw out our geometry, we'll have our whatever Z tool that we want to load up. And so if we've loaded a specific OBJ that we want to start working with, that'll be located in here once we've imported it. But let's, in this lesson, just concentrate more on the primitives here. And so you can see we have a number of different kinds of primitives that we can select. A sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, ring, okay, a sweep profile, terrain, a plane. You can look at all of these. So what we can do is come in, and I'm just going to choose, let's just choose the sphere to begin with, and we'll just because it's simpler to see. So choose a sphere, and we'll draw it onto the canvas. And let's go ahead and hit T to go to edit mode. All right, so one thing that I want to be able to do is maybe see the wireframe of this. So if we go to transform, you can see there's an option for draw polyframe, and the hotkey for that is Shift F. It's also going to be located on your right hand shelf, although you can't see it on my screen. So if we want to see the wireframe, we can turn on polyframe, and that'll show you the current wireframe. So it's pretty typical of a sphere. So since this is still a primitive, we can actually manipulate the resolution of this sphere. So to manipulate the kind of the creation settings of any primitive that you draw onto your canvas once you're in edit mode, then you want to go down to the tool palette, and you're going to want to go almost all the way to the bottom down to initialize. And if you open that up, these are the settings that you're going to be able to change for your actual sphere. So you can see that we have size in the X, Y, and Z directions. We have coverage, and we have H and V divide. Okay, so that's going to be your resolution settings, and then these are going to be your size and also the coverage. So take a look at these individually. If I look at the X size, you can see I can kind of squash that down in any direction. Okay, so it gives you an indication of what direction's what. If you change the coverage from 360 degrees, you can create sort of slices. So coming in here, you can create sort of a sliced look if you change that angle value down to something lower than 360 degrees, so that can be useful. You can also change the subdivision. So if you want to make this a little bit lower, you can change this number, and I can just click on the number and put it in numerically, or I can use the slider. I can take this down to something really low. Okay, if I want to get something down here like this, maybe 32 by 18, and I can change that here in the initialize. Now, once we've modified our primitive, the next thing we want to do when we start working with it is convert it to a polymesh. So then at this point, you can see it still says sphere 3D. I'll just go ahead and hit make polymesh, and you can see the color slightly changes. It's now one sort of polygroup, which we'll talk about later. The resolution has stayed the same, but now this is a polygon model, so I can come in here and modify it. If I use move brush, and we'll talk about these brushes later, but I can go in and manipulate this. Now, the different primitives will have different initialization settings. So if I grab a ring, and you can see if I am in edit mode and I have a tool selected, then that will allow me just to come in and switch that tool out. So if I'm working with a particular tool and I want to just start to work with another one, I can go ahead and select that tool, and that'll swap it out. And when I do that, anything that I've done sculpting wise or modification wise on that tool is not going to be lost. It's still kind of in this bucket, and assuming you've saved it out, it's going to be located on your hard drive as well. So don't think, you know, if you accidentally click one of these, then that is gone. All you have to do is go back in here and get it back, draw it back onto the canvas. In this case, you don't even have to draw it back onto the canvas, you just have to select it. So with this one selected, again, we'll go back down to initialize, and you can see here we have some different settings. So we have a small radius, we have radial coverage, which again is like that sphere, so you can see we can create sort of a partial ring here. In this case, we also have scale, so this is kind of cool. You can create kind of a trailing effect here, kind of a horn kind of a look. Okay, you can also twist it, so you can see how that geometry is twisting. It can be useful. We also have the initial twist angle here, and then the divisions here. So if we want to make it more low res or high res, we can take a look at this divide here. Okay, so there's two options here going in both directions. change the scale back up to 1, and it's the same on both sides. You can see you can take the twist down to 0, get the coverage back up. So each primitive will have its own set of options for you. And then once you get where you want to go, you got to scale it down. I want to make kind of a horn, let's say. Increase the radius. So once we've got that, we can now go in, make that a polymesh, and now we've got a polygon model that we can start to change and manipulate. All right. So when you're working with primitives, you draw them out onto the canvas. Make sure you go to edit mode, and then you can change a lot of the different settings for those by going into your initialize option here. You can see, since this is a polymesh, if I now go down to the bottom of my tool palette, I don't have that initialize section anymore, but if I go back and grab a primitive, you can see that initialize section's here. So it updates based on the kind of model that you have currently drawn onto the canvas and you currently have active. It will tell you what you need to do. And if you try to sculpt on this, it's going to give you an indication that you need to make it a polymesh. So it's not going to let you modify it or sculpt it if it's still a primitive. Okay, so those are some of the primitive shapes that ZBrush provides, and actually it's kind of surprising how many different kinds of shapes you can get from some of these. You can see we have a gear right here. We can go into initialize. We can change the coverage. Here's the kind of the thickness of the width, the inner radius, how that's skewed, outer radius. You have options here for a curve, so you can change sort of the profile curve. You see this sort of interface a lot. You can add those little intersections, those divisions here. You can change that sort of look. So this particular one has a ton of initialize sort of settings that you can change to get something that looks, if you're creating a gear or something, some sort of mechanical detail. You can go in here and really modify a lot of this before you even get into trying to sculpt it. So, the more you can do with your initialize settings to get that starting point, the better off you are when you get going with building the rest of your model. Now there are, besides the primitives in ZBrush, there are a ton of kind of pieces of geometry that you can bring in to practice with. You'll notice a button up here on the top shelf called Lightbox. If you go ahead and open up Lightbox, and you can choose from, you can see project, tool, brush, texture. So these are all sort of presets that you can bring in. If you go to tool, that's where you'll find a lot of different pieces of geometry. So you have the demo soldier, the dog that you're familiar with. There's a lot of different types of models in here that you can start with just to take a look at examples of things that you can bring in. If you just want to kind of load that up, you can just double click on that. That'll bring that up. And the comma key will bring up Lightbox as well. And so now I've got this in edit mode. You can see all the wireframe. So if I turn off polyframe, that'll show me that. You can see the model that I currently have is taking on the aspect of whatever material that I currently have selected. So if I change the material, it's going to change the look of the model. Now there is a way to fill the model with a particular material, but in this case, leaving that unfilled enables us to change materials and see what different materials look like on our models. And we'll talk more about materials later, but that's kind of why that's changing. And now we have a kind of a model here made of multiple subtools, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you can access those starting points in Lightbox. There's, again, a ton of different kinds of things that you can load up. Also, different projects. Projects are going to enable you to load up more than just a particular model, but an entire project, which includes a lot of other information. Okay, so talking about Z projects, the next thing that we're going to discuss in the next lesson is the different kinds of files that we can work with. So it's important to keep yourself kind of clear on what it is you're actually saving, because sometimes it's unclear whether you're saving the document, but you're not saving the tool, and so you just want to be clear on what you need to save to keep all the work that you've done. So in the next lesson, we will talk about the different kinds of files that we can work with in ZBrush and what saving those means, what we're actually saving inside of those files. So we'll go ahead and talk about that next.